Some of the big news that has been breaking the last couple of days around the Department of Defense authorizing the release of 3 Navy videos that the Navy has categorized as unidentified. Some of you may say, especially if you've been following the stories on Den of Geek, that, hey, weren't these videos released before? And if you are thinking that, you're right. They were. So let me go over a short history. There's a lot to this story and the background. One of the gentlemen that we're going to have on, Colonel John Alexander, actually has been attached to some of the background with government kind of research in this area for decades. So we'll talk to him in just a minute. But really, this story and the surfacing of these videos started in 2017 with a rock star, Tom DeLonge of Blink-182. He started an organization called To the Stars Academy in October 2017. He had an interesting board of very credible people, one of those being Luis Elizondo, who worked for the Office of the Secretary of Defense as an intelligence agent. And he says at that job, he investigated UFOs. For those of us who cover this topic, we were very shocked, because the government has told us since the closing of Project Blue Book in 1969, they've not had anything to do with UFOs nor wanted to. In December of 2017, the New York Times dove into this topic and Luis Elizondo's claims, and they wrote a story about this organization called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, called ATIP, that Luis ran, that did investigate UFOs. They also released a couple videos, one from 2005 and another, or 2004 incident in the San Diego area, and one from 2015 on the East Coast. And these videos were allegedly from jet fighters that had captured in their infrared cameras these objects that these fighters had actually chased and couldn't catch. In 2004, one of these pilots actually went on the record in that New York Times article saying he chased an object that looked like a giant Tic Tac, white Tic Tac, and it outmaneuvered him and he couldn't catch up to it. Later on, one of the pilots that was part of the Nimitz aircraft carrier strike group was determined to go get video of this object, and he did. And that's one of the videos that has been released. And so we had a lot of information that had verified that these videos were real to begin with, back with this New York Times article. Luis Elizondo had come under a bit of fire saying, hey, were those videos even authorized to be released? George Knapp of Las Vegas, investigative journalist who's been covering this topic for a long time, leaked a form called a DD 1910. And this is a form that Luis had said he used to get authorization from the Navy to release those videos. And sure enough, they're stamped on that form, says cleared for public release. Later on, some of us, including myself via FOIA, received more information, including some email correspondence between Luis and the Navy showing, yes, the Navy did approve those videos to be released. So we get into the reaction by the US Navy and the DoD, Department of Defense. The Navy's been very positive about their response. They've said, yes, we do take UFOs, or in particular, they've been using this term UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, same thing as a UFO, but they say we take UAPs very seriously. They then release that they, as a result of this, have kind of revamped their UAP reporting for their personnel. Those reporting protocols that were revamped are secret, so they classified. We haven't been able to see those, but that indeed did happen. The Navy also said, yes, those videos were real. We back up our pilots who said they were there, and we do classify those incidents as unidentified. The Department of Defense, however, has had a different reaction. They began by saying that ATIP didn't investigate UFOs, that Luis Elizondo didn't work with ATIP, that they had nothing to do with those, the Department of Defense had nothing to do with those videos, implying that they were not real. They've had to recant all of those things given evidence that has arisen. And in this latest released just a couple of days ago, it's kind of another recant. They're finally saying, okay, we admit those videos are real. We're releasing our own versions that you can go download. However, they're claiming this is the first time they've been authorized for release, despite that DD 1910 form that has been out in the public showing that the Navy had released those actually back in 2017. So it's a very interesting, long story. You can read more of my stories at Den of Geek for that. So we have a couple of guests here to talk about this topic. We've got John Alexander, retired colonel. Let's bring him on here. John has worked in Army intelligence. He's also a defense contractor and worked at Los Alamos. And he's also a defense consultant, widely known for being an expert on non-lethal weapons. We've also got Robert Powell, who's an author of the book UFOs and Government, a historical inquiry. He also is a founder and board member of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. So welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks, Alejandro.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So, John, my take on this latest release is kind of the DOD playing a little bit of a game still, finally coming clean and saying, okay, we admit that those videos are real, but we only authorize the release now, even though Elizondo had provided those forms earlier. What's your take on how the Navy and the DOD have reacted to this situation?
My take is I'm not at all surprised because basically there's no coordination. And I don't think that it's surprising that one hand doesn't know what the other one's doing. As you know, I had run a similar program like 35 years ago, and one of the things we looked for was, where does the information go? Is there any coordination? And bottom line was no. So the other aspect, I think, is they don't like to be embarrassed. I mean, this idea of not being able to explain things is, not considered good. So there's a bit of embarrassment. And as well, I think a total lack of coordination, which is something that's just endemic in the government today.
Right. And then, Robert, so you have been investigating this stuff or doing FOIA requests for quite some time. And you've had, I guess, would it surprise you or does it surprise you that the DOD's responses have been so inaccurate?
No, it doesn't surprise me at all, Alejandro. And I agree with John on the lack of coordination. The Nimitz case, the one that occurred in 2004 that was released by the New York Times, December 17th of 2017. I actually started investigating that case back in 2016. And I sent FOIA requests to about a dozen different Navy organizations, including the Office of Naval Intelligence. And all of those requests came back with, they didn't have any information, no FLIR video, nothing. So it doesn't surprise me that, you see this bantering back and forth.
Mm-hmm. If I might add, if you remember some of the discussion that went on at that time was that when they say they didn't have it, that's just totally not surprising to me. And because one of the things that came up early on was that an admiral had found these things basically sitting in a drawer. The study I ran 35 years ago, we found other reports, different kinds of incidents. They would not have existed had they not been in somebody's personal safe. But for the institution to know that is totally different.
Mm-hmm. Now, Robert, the Navy taking this positive response, to me, seems like a very change in their methodology. For the Navy to come out and say, we take this seriously, we really believe the objects in this video to be unidentified, is that surprising to you?
Yes, that was surprising to me when it first happened, because historically, the Navy and especially the U.S. Air Force have always tried to avoid commentary on this. I mean, it was like a hot potato that nobody wanted. So I'm surprised, and I wonder why has the Navy agreed to be more open on this? I don't have a good answer.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think a good bit of that may be Chris Mellon. because he was with the Two Stars Academy, and he, I think, is instrumental in that he used to be an assistant secretary of defense for intelligence. So he had access to this and was instrumental in trying to get people to come forward and release the information, and still is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the level of credibility of all the people who have come forward, Chris Mellon, Luis Elizondo, also the pilots, the radar experts in relation to the Nimitz, and the pilots even in the 2015 incident. It's really kind of overwhelming, all of this credibility, these people coming forward to say that, yeah, we either chased it, we caught it on radar, it did not act like anything that we've seen before. And they go so far as to say they doubt that whatever this is was man-made.
But you remember, there's another aspect of it, and that's the UFO community itself, where you had a number of people who were poo-pooing this stuff despite all the credibility of the people involved.
Right, and that's a good segue to the next point, which is that the UFO community has had a very strange reaction, some denying that any of this really happened, some doing the opposite and saying this is the beginning of some sort of other disclosure. Now, John, this question I guess I'll pose to you first. This idea that the Navy's getting us ready to reveal some bigger secrets. Now, when you were in Army intelligence, you and colleagues actually looked to find out if there are any hidden UFO secrets. Are there?
Well, we do know that now that there's certainly other tapes that have come in. I'm not quite sure why you're not getting released. When you look at this stuff's over a decade old anyway. Now, there are certain very good reasons for not releasing some of the data, and that has to do with sources and methods, i.e. how good are your sensor systems, and by revealing some of the things, you're telling potential adversaries, what our sensors can do. But I think that, but is there a big aha? Remember, 20% of the world population not only talks about UFOs, but think that ET's here and walking among us. And if you work with it like Steve Bassett, that's the thing that he wants to come out, is that they're there, and it transitions from there to, oh, and by the way, we're communicating with them. And some people say they're running the show. What I've said recently, and if you watch what's going on with coronavirus, if ET is here, it's not for our benefit.
Mm-hmm. And as far as you know, it doesn't seem like there are, at least the way you framed it before, is that it seems that the military is just as baffled by these incidents as anybody else.
I think that's absolutely true. And you also, there's an embarrassment factor that has been built up, for decades now. And it's, they don't like to come out and admit, here's what we don't know. In some ways, you're also exposing potential intelligence gaps by saying, if we don't understand this, what else is there that you don't understand? People can look at it, make that argument, which may be one of the reasons for continued classification in some areas.
Mm-hmm. And Robert, what about you? I mean, doing your investigation and your research into UFO files, government UFO files, freedom of information, do you see any indication that, there is an alien working at Area 51 or any kind of major kind of conspiracy going on like many UFO researchers or the UFO community believe? No,
I don't think there's any indication of that, Alejandro. And I'm like John. I think the military, I'm actually worried to say that I think the military knows very little more about it than we do, which I think is a concern. I think that's a risk that there should not exist. So I think I am hoping that there is someone in the military organizations that are investigating this. Take the Navy, for example, when they released those videos and indicated they're real, they actually opened a barn door, right? Because the national media has not really pushed them on this question yet. But if you save those videos and you say you don't know what they were, you didn't throw away the radar data, right? And there is tons of radar information. There was a cruiser a aircraft carrier. There was an E-2 Hawkeye. There was also the F-18s themselves. There's a lot of radar data that would tell you exactly how fast that object could fly, what its acceleration capabilities are. And so the question becomes, where is that data?
Mm-hmm. Now, John, despite, feeling that the military is likely none more the wiser than most people, at least not much, you do believe that the UFO question poses a genuine mystery, and that there are more genuine, unidentified, UFO cases out there.
Oh, absolutely. But my bias, though, is that the phenomena that we're looking at are far broader than just UFOs. And I think one of the problems we have in studying these things is we tend to put them in little stovepipes. And I think it's far broader. Remember, the last paragraph of my book on UFOs goes something like, and whatever this is, it is more complex than we imagine, or maybe we can imagine.
Right. And so, Robert, I know you feel similarly. In particular, you did a report, we're part of a report with the Scientific Coalition for Ufology. And for full disclosure, I'm also a part of this organization, the SCU, as an advisor. You wrote a report where you all analyzed, given the witness testimony and the video, the characteristics of the object. And what you found out was pretty startling, right? Maybe you can put in a thumbnail about what happened and what you discovered.
So we looked specifically at the acceleration numbers that we calculated that these objects displayed. And we did it 3 different ways. One, we based it on what the senior chief told us happened on radar. Second, we based it on what the 2 pilots, well, actually there are 4 pilots, but the 2 different aircraft, what they said they saw. And then third, we based it on the video itself. We came up with acceleration values that varied from a low of 60 G-forces to as high as thousands of G-forces. And we're pretty confident those numbers are real. So that's why we would love to have the radar data, because then we could get the exact accelerations and exact speeds of these objects.
What sort of speeds were you looking at?
Oh, depending on which of those 3 we were analyzing, we had speeds up to 40,000 miles per hour. And this is at low altitude, no sonic boom. I mean, those objects should have been a ball of molten metal if they were anything that we currently use.
Yeah. If I might add, these are not new findings. I mean, they are specific to that case, but we have known this. And in fact, in my briefings, again, 35 years ago, we talked about high G right angle turn, instant acceleration to speeds that were unimaginable. So it's not new that the government has encountered these.
Mm-hmm.
Well, John's absolutely right on that. There are case reports out of the military from the 1950s where you can calculate the object's G-forces were well above 50 and 60 Gs. And you can make these calculations because when a pilot sees an object close to him, when that object disappears into the sky, it takes a certain speed to disappear from your eyesight within a certain period of time. And from that, you can actually calculate the speed and the resulting G-forces.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to G-forces, isn't it somewhere around 16 Gs that an actual F-18 will start to fall apart?
Yeah, I believe an F-18 can take up around 16 Gs, but the pilot, he's only going to take about 6 to 7 Gs.
Yeah, that 9 for a pilot, as low as 2, some people start to go unconscious.
That'd be me.
But the pilot, 9 is the max.
Wow. Yeah, so extraordinary results there. So some of the questions from the chat here. One person asked, so why is the Pentagon doing this now?
A, don't know, but B, I think basically just to make it go away. This is for them is a real pain in the ass. And so I guess by acknowledging, they hope that it'll just evaporate and they won't have to deal with it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it could become a bigger pain in the rear if the media start asking them about where's the radar data.
Or some of the tougher questions. Because one of the backstories here is some of you may have heard of Bigelow Aerospace. They were actually hired by ATIP to help investigate some of all of this. And it's owned by Robert Bigelow, a real estate magnate in Las Vegas, where you live, John. And in fact, John, you helped Bigelow begin his paranormal investigations. Was it back in the 90s?
Yeah, when I left Los Alamos, we created NIDS, the National Institute for Discovery Science, in '95. And Bob, I might ask you, was interested specifically in two areas. One was UFOs, the other was continuation of consciousness or life after death.
Very interesting. And someone asked about that consciousness question. Do you find any relation between UFOs and consciousness?
I personally do, and I think there's an interrelationship between this and a whole host of phenomena, that consciousness is key to it.
Now, Robert,
if I might add, though, that does not mean that we're not looking at physical things. I mean, the incidents we're describing are absolutely physical, three-dimensional reality as we continue here. It's just that consciousness somehow plays a piece in that.
You've got some history also with some of these players. So people like Chris Mellon, other people that are part of To the Stars, like Hal Puthoff, Dr. Eric Davis. They also had been working with Bigelow for decades. So it's kind of like this group of people who have been looking into all of this. And finally, a lot of it is kind of coming to fruition, at least coming into the public eye. Robert, you also have a little bit of background. You work with the Mutual UFO Network, the largest kind of civilian UFO investigation group. And during a period of time, they actually were working with Bigelow to do some UFO investigations. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, if I recall right, seems like back in 2009 and 2010. And basically, Bigelow funded MUFON in order for them to put together a star team. So whenever there was a case that looked very interesting, that you could basically fly one or two guys out to that location and talk to the witnesses within 48 hours of when the event occurred. And in return, he wanted the reports and the information that was gathered.
Someone's asking, why has Bigelow kept some of this information private? Now, I will say, when it comes to the Mutual UFO Network and what that partnership, I personally was able to write about the best cases that came out of that. So even though there's some conspiracy that some of that information was hidden, it wasn't. I got to write stories that I wrote to the public all about those. And there's some great cases. But he does keep a lot to himself. Maybe, John, do you want to speak to that?
Well, I think, contrary to popular belief, an awful lot of this is public, and a number of us have done books. Same with Skinwalker Ranch and that. Having said that, Bob has just always been a very private person. And a lot of it's his personal interest. And this goes back to incidents that happened, as you know, with his grandparents and things many years ago that got his interest in there. Most of the information, I think, actually is out there. Now, that does not include the things that the ATIP program.
Right. And, to your point, I know NIDS used to create reports about all of their investigations. And despite that, many in the UFO community kind of still criticized them for keeping secrets, which brings me to another point, is kind of the idea behind conspiracies there. So, for instance, John, a lot of people feel that you're one of the main, secret keepers, part of this group, this alleged group called MJ12 that is overseeing all of the secrets. I mean, is it kind of interesting that whenever something like this comes to light, such as Bigelow lending a helping hand to actually investigate this, when you would think that they would be a hero, they often get demonized?
Oh, that's absolutely true. Look at what's happening with Dr. Fauci now. Gates trying to help, and automatically it transitions to we're going to depopulate the world. And I mean, conspiracy theory is just difficult to understand. But as you know, in all of my talks, that if you're going to be involved in understanding these phenomena at all publicly, you better understand conspiracy theory, because either you believe there's cover-ups, or if you don't, you're part of the cover-up.
Right. Robert, you've ran into this quite a bit. Have you ever given any time to some of these conspiracies, and has your research ever borne out any credibility in that area?
Well, on conspiracy theories, I used to think that there was not even a government organization that investigated UFOs. But after the Nimitz incident, I was able to verify through two different sailors that there was a helicopter which apparently came on board the USS Princeton and removed all of the radar tapes. Until then, I never believed that there was anyone in the military who went around trying to collect data. And I see the world in shades of gray. So that doesn't mean I'm now a conspiracy theorist believer. I just believe now that there's more likelihood that there is someone who tries to collect data, and whether they collect it to analyze it or they collect it to throw it in the garbage, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. You know, we discussed this yesterday. I went and looked, and I said, since Blue Book, there have been probably around 600 flag grade officers in the Department of Defense. If they are like the normal population, that means probably about 60 of them have seen something. And my question then is not, why are these little programs also? Why is there a hell of a lot more just based on personal incident? I did write to an example, because I had talked to the heads of all of these intelligence agencies. One of them was a retired 3-star who headed one of those 3-letter things. And he said, A, we don't do that. B, I'll tell you about the ones I saw. So, you know, here's the head of an agency who has the resources, who had a personal experience that he could not explain. It happened many years before. But that did not translate from individual interest to institutional interest or responsibility.
Mm-hmm. And I've seen some evidence that hasn't been for public consumption, unfortunately, yet, that the organization Luis Elizondo belonged to, although the DoD claimed funding ending and the program ended in 2012, Elizondo said he worked on it afterwards. And like I said, I've seen evidence of that. And I believe Elizondo that organization does continue. He says they've changed their name because they don't really want to be known or in the public. Do you both believe that that is likely the case, that that program does continue?
Well, I'm sure that some aspect of it certainly does.
Mm-hmm. Now, to your earlier question about why aren't there more of these organizations researching this sort of stuff? Elizondo's experience that he had shared kind of shed some light on this, and actually how Puthoff ran into similar situations working on things like remote viewing, like you have done, John, and perhaps then you can identify with this. But they had said that there were actually one of the biggest groups keeping this sort of UFO or paranormal investigations happening in the government were religious factions who felt that this was all demonic and that it shouldn't be looked at. And they actually killed funding to many different programs, including the first iteration of the ATIP program, which was wider in scope, looking into more paranormal stuff.
Yeah, that is not unique. That's we ran into that again decades ago, and you do have some very high levels. A number of people who are fundamentalist Christians and do take A, you can do that, B, you shouldn't, because it's the work of the devil.
Mm-hmm. Now, another question came in. We'll just take a couple more here. That's a good segue to it. One of the really initial inspirations for the funding of this program that Luis Elizondo belonged to, this whole thing was founded by Senator Harry Reid, who was also friends with Bigelow. And he was aware that Bigelow was investigating this ranch called the Skinwalker Ranch, which had a lot of paranormal activity. And that was part of the initial investigation around these funds in this organization that Lou eventually became head of. And of course, John, you're familiar with it because you've been there and you helped kind of start up investigations there. Some people would like to kind of hear your take on the Skinwalker Ranch.
Wow, that's a segue to a whole new front. It is a very, very strange place. I want to mention, though, that a guy who deserves a lot of credit in here is George Knapp, because he's one who had been feeding Senator Reid for a long time. I had met Reid. He actually came and visited us at one of the NID's Science Advisory Board meetings. But George is the one who kind of kept prodding him and bringing him along. The ranch, I don't know where to begin on that, except to say very, very strange things happen. As you know, there's now a new series that's out on the secret of Skinwalker Ranch. I think the only thing that's wrong is it's not the secret. I think there are secrets. I think, again, you're looking at multiple phenomena. And it's one of the things that, having worked there, I was the first one to spend the night on the ranch the day Bob actually bought it. But the kinds of strange thing there, breadth of phenomena that have occurred there, again, with our folks watching it and hard evidence of physical events occurring, just totally mind-boggling.
Mm-hmm. And then another question would be, and I guess I'll take this to you, Robert, and then John, get your take on this as well. Because the DoD has made this recent announcement, and the Navy's been so forthcoming recently, at least saying they take all of this seriously, do you think this will have a positive response when it comes to other military personnel making reports or feeling comfortable to share their stories? Like, have you had more people coming to you?
Not recently, but when the New York Times story came out, I had people that contacted me that were out of the service and gave me their stories. I think it really depends on how the phenomenon is handled within the services themselves, right? Because I've had many guys in the military. A good example is one guy said, you know, we were on a destroyer and we had this disc-shaped object that was right above us, and we were watching it, and then it took off, just zipped away. And I asked the captain, should I, put that in our logs? And the captain said, no, I want to make admiral someday. Mm-hmm. And that's not because he was trying to hide something or someone told him to hide it. It's just that, just like in our society, right, there's this stigma whenever you talk about it. Just like you're probably not going to go to your boss and tell him, I'd love to study UFOs. It really excites me. Well, that's probably going to impact your ability to get promoted.
Right.
And the same thing happens in the military. So it's just an extension of our society.
It is. As I say, this is not known as career enhancing. So, and by the way, I had run into that in talking to folks at NORAD who had picked up things, and very early on, the low-level operator said, you do not forward these things. It's just not in your best interest.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank you both for joining us. Robert is going to be doing another live stream talking about some anomalous materials right in May 6th. And you can find that on the SCU, or the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies Facebook, and all their social media and their website, explorescu.org. Was there anything else you want to plug here, Robert, while you have a chance?
No, that's good. I think it will be it's about the some material from the Ubatuba region of Brazil that was found actually back in the late 1950s. So we did testing using high-res ICP-MS chemical testing to look at isotope ratios. So that's about all I'll say about it for now.
And John, you actually have one of my absolute favorite books on this topic. Could you share the title and where people can find it?
I assume you're talking about the older one, which would be UFOs, Myths, Conspiracies, and Realities. More recently, I did the Reality Denied, and I did include it there in case we haven't talked about it with Chris Bledsoe, but it ended up as a personal sighting of mine, the second time ever that I had a personal interaction with it. And I think they're both available on Amazon.
All right. Well, great. Thank you all both so much for joining us.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you all for watching. Stay tuned to Den of Geek for more UFO news. You can find in the comments links to some of my stories that give you some background of some of what we talked about today. Some of you are asking kind of why. Really, it's because Luis Elizondo, this guy came out to speak. And the reason he came out is because Tom DeLonge, this rock star, gave him this platform. And there were a lot of these people like John Alexander and others who had been working with Bigelow and others who gave, provided this space for Luis to feel comfortable to do that. So it's great. You can find out all about that. We've got stories on Tom DeLonge, on Lou, on Skinwalker, and everything right here at Den of Geek. So stay tuned. If we can get a hold of some more people to talk about this, we will. Thank you so much for joining.